Mind Flayers are one of the seminal Dungeons & Dragons monsters invented by Gary Gygax himself way back in the earliest days of the game. Mind Flayers are incredibly unique in their appearance and are almost as recognizable to Dungeons & Dragons as Beholders or the dragons themselves. I mean, more recognizable to D&D if Stranger Things has anything to say about it. However, the sheer popularity of Mind Flayers can make them difficult to make formidable because your players are likely already familiar with them. Especially if your players are D&D veterans, Mind Flayers can suffer from the same cultural osmosis that vampires do. But if presented carefully to your players, Mind Flayers can still be challenging and terrifying foes that can allow you to turn your players' meta knowledge against them. Hello, my name is Byrne, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make Mind Flayers formidable.
I don't know what they are. I've never seen anything like them before. They're alien. But I saw what they did. Their tentacles wrapped around his throat and his face, and they cracked his head open. They're Mind Flayers.
So, what is a Mind Flayer if you don't already know? If you are a new player to D&D and you've seen pictures of them and you're like, I want to feature these, they seem so cool, I want to confront my players with them, but I don't really know much about them. Honestly, the only things you need to know about Mind Flayers are that their true name is Illithid. Mind Flayer, in my mind, is a sort of nickname that gets given to them by the commoners. Illithids are highly intelligent, alien-like creatures with 4 tentacles of an octopus kind of extending out the bottom of their head instead of a mouth. They still have a mouth. In my mind, the mouth is like a little beak or something like that to crack open a skull, but you usually don't see it because it's concealed by their 4 long octopus-like tentacles. They are psionically empowered creatures, or psychically empowered if there's a difference. Basically, they can think you to death, but they can also read thoughts to some extent. And they use this power to enthrall other races to do their bidding for them. They don't like to get their hands dirty. They don't like to do the dirty work. Their main delicacy is humanoid brains, which provides them with the nutrients and enzymes, but also the psychic energy they need to live. So they can absorb somebody's thoughts, their memories, and their personality by consuming that individual's brains. Their reproductive system involves inserting an alien tadpole into a person's eye, which then eats the victim's brains before mutating them into another Mind Flayer. This process has a name. It's called ceramorphosis. That's what I'm gonna go with. There's a ton more lore about Mind Flayers that you can find online. There's also a pretty good chapter about Mind Flayers in Volo's Guide to Monsters, for as relevant as that book still is now that Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse has come out. But honestly, I found that the more I educated myself on Mind Flayers, the more I read that chapter in Volo's Guide, the less scary they became. If you know where a creature goes to the toilet, then they're not scary anymore. Mind Flayers were directly inspired by Tim Kirk's cover art on a novel called The Burrowers Beneath. And that novel is part of the Cthulhu mythos, which is themed around fear of the alien, the unknowable, the abject, the creatures that make you frightened just by looking at them, but you can't put a finger on exactly why they're scary. Mind Flayers are frightening when and because they are alien and mysterious. They are unknowable. They scratch that part of our brain that makes us squirm in discomfort because they look so odd. Existential horror and body horror are huge parts of what we're going to lean into to make Mind Flayers seem formidable. And the more that's understood about them by the players, the less formidable they seem. You want to lean into Mind Flayers alien appearance and present that as being horrific all on its own, describing how their tentacles move and twist and writhe in constant movement, as if they move with the Mind Flayer's thoughts. Their hands are too long and open and close like giant arachnids. Their eyes are ablaze with intelligence, but not a single thought is betrayed in their hollow, expressionless faces. Even the fact that Mind Flayers eat brains specifically is part of what makes them horrifying. The thought of having your head wrapped in sticky tentacles while your skull is painfully cracked open and your brains are sucked out, and then you simply are not there anymore. The real trick to making Mind Flayers formidable is choosing when and how you present them to your players. Mind Flayers are definitely a monster where less, much less, barely anything is a lot more. They make for great early to mid-level threats, around levels 4 to 7, because at that level range, players are starting to feel more powerful. They've unlocked their multi-attack and they have access to more powerful third level spells. At the same time, at this level, a single Mind Flayer is still a significant mechanical threat to the player characters. They're also still at a level where acquiring magic items with ease shouldn't really be possible, especially if you're playing in a dark fantasy style campaign where magic items should be rare and difficult to come across. Don't confront your party with Mind Flayers when they're able to easily deal with the threat of a Mind Flayer. Dread comes when you know you must face a challenge ill-prepared and may fall victim to a horrific fate, such as getting your brain sucked out if you fail. Build up some great threat to the realm, like an army of insectile monsters, a spreading curse that only affects those while they're asleep, missing townsfolk that have started joining a secretive cult, an entire town that appears to have just up and vanished, but everything in the village is still there. It just looks like they dropped everything and walked away one day. Only reveal that the threat is actually a cabal of Mind Flayers when the party are too involved to escape a confrontation with their true enemy. With a little luck, you'll end up with your players' meta-knowledge used against them, as they thought they were simply coming to exterminate one fairly simple threat, only to realize how ill-prepared they are for a much worse one. Ideally, in this situation, what happens is that if your players don't know what a Mind Flayer is, great, the mystery is maintained and they can slowly learn the horrific truth through playing. But if your players do know what a Mind Flayer is, even if their characters don't, they still get the full feeling of dread when they realize, oh no, we're going up against Mind Flayers. So let's look at some great Mind Flayer thrall options. The first are cultists, a cult devoted to some sort of etheric elder god type being that the party discover too late is actually devoted to Mind Flayers. They make for a great evolving threat because the player characters might have to fight their way through or infiltrate their way through different levels of the cult. You might have sort of the base cultist stat block for the earliest levels and then pull in some beefier humanoid stat blocks for higher level cultists. Your cultists could be zombie-like thralls that have been dominated by the Mind Flayers, and so there's clearly something wrong with them. And you can mingle monsters, aberrant monsters, which we'll talk about in a second, in among the cultists to make them seem more dangerous themselves and kind of slowly reveal more and more about the supernatural elements of this cult beyond just the humanoid threats. But what if you had the players infiltrate a Mind Flayer cult having no idea what the cult is actually in service of, and then some higher priest or leader in the cult holds a ritual, and at the climax of the ritual, they turn into a Mind Flayer then and there. They've been undergoing the process of ceramorphosis, and it's just this horrific event that happens in the middle of your campaign, and bam, now it's a Mind Flayer fight. The players have had no chance to prepare for it and probably have to get the hell out of Dodge. It's one hell of a way to reveal that your players are now fighting Mind Flayers. A historic thrall of the Mind Flayers are the Githyanki and the Githzerai, as they later became known as. They have in their lore, in their background, that they were once enthralled by the Mind Flayers and have since broken those bonds and are now mortal enemies of all Mind Flayers, as well as the Githyanki and Githzerai being mortal enemies of each other. But when I ran them, all I knew was that they had once or were thralls of the Mind Flayers. So I thought, great, I will use them as my Mind Flayer thralls. And they work really well. Gith aren't really commonly known about to folks that don't already play D&D. They're less recognizable than the Mind Flayer itself. So they make a great sort of higher tier threat. Their stat blocks are a bit stronger than what your typical cultist might be, but also very strange, very alien. They appear very odd. And so your players might have an inbuilt mystery of trying to figure out what these things are before they're even trying to realize that they're actually enthralled to the Mind Flayers, to an even greater threat. One idea that I got that I really liked from watching the Swarm episode of season 3 of Love, Death and Robots, which I talk about in this video, is this idea of insectile thralls for the Mind Flayers. I think that insectile monsters make for good, disgusting, aberrant enemies that instantly might be able to gross your players out. It builds a good mystery because your insectile monsters in theory can't be interviewed or interrogated for information, so your players don't accidentally learn about the Mind Flayers early on. They also seem like a straightforward threat. I'm just going to go and wipe out this, insect hive. That doesn't seem particularly hard or complicated. And in terms of stat blocks, you could use the Ankheg, the giant spider, the carrion crawler, the chul. All these stat blocks can be easily reflavored into different types of insectile monsters living in as part of a big hive, a big swarm in service to the Mind Flayers. And of course, there are the Mind Flayer-esque monsters themselves. The little larvae tadpole of a Mind Flayer can be put into almost any creature, and there's a lot of different stat blocks for a lot of different types of monsters that have been turned into a Mind Flayer-like creature that can be great for your Mind Flayer thralls, especially because your players might not instantly recognize them as being Mind Flayer thralls. One of my favorites, which was in Volo's guide, is the Mind Witness, and this is, in the lore, a beholder that has been captured by Mind Flayers. By the lore, a Mind Witness is a beholder that has suffered a Mind Flayer transformation, and so now it's this kind of half beholder, half Mind Flayer, gribbly monster. But honestly, just like the Gith, grabbed an aberrant, tentacly, floating eye monster miniature that I had, put that down in front of the players, and they didn't need to understand that it had once been a beholder, or in my campaign, in your campaign, it doesn't have to have once been a beholder. It could just be some alien creature that has been enthralled by the Mind Flayers or created by the Mind Flayers. And honestly, again, that probably makes it scarier if it's something the players don't have a frame of reference for. It's like, what is this thing? It's tentacles, it's stunning us, it's turning us to stone, whatever it does. Another great common Mind Flayer thrall is minion, really, is the Intellect Devourer. And these things are really scary for players to go up against because they have abilities that allow them to just delete player characters by stunning them, teleporting into their character's body, and then puppeteering the character's body around, and now they sort of instantly kill the character. I'm not really a fan of the brain dog appearance to them. They just kind of look like Pluto is Mickey Mouse's dog, and Dino is the Flintstones dog, and of course a brain with dog legs is a Mind Flayer's dog. I think that's kind of goofy. Goofy is a dog. Anyway, when I ran Mind Flayers a couple of years ago, I found this really amazing piece of art called In the Court of the Hollow King, which is by Alex Konstad. Looks like a brain kind of floating in the air, and the circulatory system just floats down beneath it. The entire circulatory system, no bones, no skin, nothing else. And it just has this really creepy vibe to it that I was like, that's what an Intellect Devourer should be. Something that looks not like a monster. It doesn't have claws or teeth. It doesn't look like a dog. It looks like something completely alien. And I just had the image in my head of a Mind Flayer being slowly followed around by these floating Intellect Devourers that are almost like bodyguards to it. Their minds are so powerful that they just remove threats to the Mind Flayer around it. So I thought that was a great alternative kind of physical description to Intellect Devourers. Well, let's take a look at the base Mind Flayer stat block, which I think is pretty strong on its own, to be honest. Its strengths are that it has magical resistance, so any spells that the players do fling at it, it at least gets advantage on its saving throws against. Its Mind Blast is pretty strong. My players learned this the hard way, and I'm not gonna lie, so did I as the GM. It's especially scary for early level parties because it does quite a lot of damage, but also if you don't have anyone in your party who's either a wizard, eldritch knight, if you don't have an intelligence type character in your party, chances are Mind Blast, which uses an intelligence save, can be scary. Of course, the Mind Flayers have what they're known for, their ability to attack with their tentacles that grapples the victim of their attack, or it has the chance to grapple them, and then they're able to move in and crack open the skull and eat the brains of the player character, which if the player character is reduced to 0 hit points by a brain extraction, no death saves, they're just dead, and I think only a wish spell or something can bring them back because their brain is missing at that point. That is part of the reason Mind Flayers have such a scary reputation. There are a few liberties that we can take with the Mind Flayer stat block. This isn't necessarily adding anything or breaking the rules, but I think just a few little tweaks to make them more scary, which is that their levitate is always on and no concentration is required. It cannot be dispelled. It's an at-will spell anyway for the Mind Flayer, but I'm just thinking of the Baldur's Gate trailer where you just see them floating around constantly. I'm like, I like that, so I'm gonna have them float around constantly. It's an unnatural way of moving, and that makes them more unnatural seeming. I also allow their detect thoughts ability to give them advantage on certain checks and maybe even attack rolls, or disadvantage on attack rolls from the character that the Mind Flayer is reading the thoughts of. And of course, I make their plane shift under certain circumstances either an at-will spell instead of a once per day, or I make it maybe a lair action, something that they can do in their lair so that they can get out of dodge quickly. I like Mind Flayers being able to easily escape a confrontation rather than needing to see it through to the end. Additions that I make to the Mind Flayer, especially if I want it to be the Mind Flayer, as we've talked about in previous videos about making things formidable, you can create a legend around the Mind Flayer, this one creature that found its way to the mortal realm to prey upon the brains of the humanoids living there. So you can give it legendary actions, you can give it legendary resistances, you can give it lair actions, you can give it a lair. The story behind the Ulitharid is that they are Mind Flayers that are born once in a blue moon from a very special little tadpole who swims into a very special eyeball, and then that person horrifically breaks apart and transforms into a very special Mind Flayer called an Ulitharid. There's a lot more lore around the Ulitharid, but basically I would just treat it like a more powerful Mind Flayer. Your player characters are a little out-leveled for a normal Mind Flayer, so you use the Ulitharid stat block instead for just a slightly beefier boy. Or you could use the Ulitharid if you wanted to be the leader of a cabal of Mind Flayers that you are having in your campaign. And of course, there's the Elder Brain itself. The Elder Brain is a Mind Flayer that has gotten old enough and smart enough to be able to have its own Mind Flayer colony. I think they're supposed to typically be Ulitharids, but again, like, I honestly don't think you as the GM needs to have a perfect understanding of the lore. But what I like about the Elder Brain stat block is that if you want to feature a Mind Flayer lair, the Elder Brain kind of is the Mind Flayer lair. They have a bunch of awesome abilities. A lot of them have a range of like 5 kilometers or 5 miles. Sorry, my Australianism showed for a second there, which means that basically if the party comes into the lair, they're going to be able to be victimized by the actions, by the stat block of the Elder Brain. They have a psychic link, which means that they can link to any party members that have been unconscious. That might be party members that have gone down in combat, but if you've got a large lair, this could just happen to party members that decide to take a long rest inside the lair. They go to sleep, bam, instant mind link to every one of them. Now the player characters have this feeling of being watched, of never being alone. Maybe they have disturbing dreams during the long rest. I think that's actually a regional effect of an Elder Brain. The Elder Brain is always aware of the party's thoughts and their movements, and yet the way I like to play it is that the party are completely unaware of what has happened until they meet the Elder Brain and learn about it and its psychic link to them by exploring the dungeon. It can just break the concentration as a legendary action of somebody concentrating on a spell, that it can use Wall of Force to protect itself, which is quite a high level spell. It has sense thoughts. It has the ability to sense the thoughts of people, I believe, that it's psychically linked to, which is really great for roleplay. It means the party can't really hide anything from the Elder Brain. If the psychic link between a character and the Elder Brain gets severed, either by the Elder Brain or by the character choosing to sever the link themselves, then it does psychic damage to them. So there's a lot of auto psychic damage coming in. There's no save against that, and there's also no save against the break concentration either, which is great. And of course, there's the psychic pulse, which I think is a legendary action as well, and it just auto damages anybody who has the psychic link to the Elder Brain. And the Elder Brain has a jacked up version of the Mind Flayer's psychic blast ability. Technically, the Elder Brain also has tentacles. Don't use those because it doesn't have multi-attack. Use all its psychic stuff first. The tentacles are just there, I don't know, maybe when it's dying, when it's getting low on HP, it can't use its psychic burst anymore. You decide as the GM, so it attacks with its tentacles, and this informs the players that it's getting weak. That's just an idea, but mainly you want to use all the psychic stuff that it can do. Psychic. Last but not least, in this Mind Flayer smorgasbord of stat blocks is the Elder Brain Dragon, which was introduced in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. I don't love this creature as much thematically, or as that, at least not compared to the Elder Brain itself, the actual leader of a Mind Flayer colony. And the reason for that is kind of similar to what I said about Intellect Devourers looking like brain dogs, and therefore that's something that the players, oh, it's a dog, I know what that is. If you have an Elder Brain Dragon, yeah, it looks like a messed up dragon, but it still looks like a dragon. There's still a frame of reference for it, so it is very powerful. Its tadpole brine breath, that's a mouthful for you, is disgusting but awesome, because when it breathes its breath weapon, it just basically vomits the Mind Flayer tadpoles over everybody, and then they have to deal with the fact that a tadpole might be burrowing around inside trying to turn them into a Mind Flayer. It's got the shatter concentration ability. It's called break concentration for the Elder Brain, but a dragon shatters concentration because it's a dragon, I suppose. I actually think I would probably use this as a Mind Flayer minion, maybe a messed up dragon that the Mind Flayers have enthralled somehow, or maybe it's not even a dragon. Maybe it's just you describe it differently but use that stat block to describe some monolithic aberrant style Shoggoth type creature. The end. There is horror in exploring a creature's lair and realizing just how bad these monsters are. Entering a Mind Flayer's lair should invoke the same hesitation and disgust as the idea of going in an alien queen's lair or a giant spider's webbed up colony. It should just have a feeling of making your player characters go, I don't want to go in there. Volo's Guide to Monsters does give some good ideas and suggestions on what chambers of a Mind Flayer's lair could look like or could be. A Mind Flayer's lair should scratch the same nerve of discomfort in your players' minds as the Mind Flayer does itself. So challenge yourself to make the lair as unnerving a place to be as possible. Spice them up a bit, aberrant them up a bit. Instead of prisoners being held in pod-like capsules, have them hung from the walls by slimy tendrils that worm beneath the victim's skin. Instead of a brain library with brains in neat little round jars, have the brains grafted into the walls by blood vessels and ichor. Instead of a chamber that has any sort of thralls or guards, have a room that is filled with tentacles that snake from the walls, feeling for passers-by. In fact, honestly, maybe the whole lair is something that is organic and alive rather than simply weird architecture. I mean, when I said earlier that the Elder Brain is the Mind Flayer's lair, what if the Elder Brain literally was the Mind Flayer's lair? The lair is the Elder Brain's body, or at least a central part of it, and it's impossible to sneak undetected around inside the lair. Mechanically true, because the Elder Brain has the ability to mentally connect with anybody within 5 miles. The The Elder Brain can then inform all the Mind Flayers in the lair if there are intruders coming through. Maybe instead of a cultivated, neat-looking brine pool, this chamber resembles the inside of a body organ with juices making up the brine pool and the tadpole offspring swimming around near the Elder Brain. Maybe you can find tadpoles throughout the lair wherever the Elder Brain's body juices can be found. Some of this is not entirely within keeping of the typical Mind Flayer lore as it's presented in 5th edition D&D, but going otherworldly and unpleasant, I think, helps Mind Flayers avoid that Saturday morning cartoon villain vibe I think they get very easily if too much of them is explained. I would create some sort of dungeon where the Mind Flayers exist that isn't even necessarily their lair. I featured Mind Flayers in an ancient, massive, fortress-like citadel thought to be haunted and abandoned by the surrounding locals. It was actually a portal into the astral plane that the Mind Flayers were invading in through. You could feature Mind Flayers in a labyrinthian insect hive, the party entering the Elder Brain's lair only at the very bottom of the hive. Things only slowly get revealed to them that Mind Flayers are in charge of this swarm of insects once they get lower and lower through the levels of the hive. Make Mind Flayer lairs or the dungeons in which they are confronted labyrinthian, possibly surreal, with as many abject horror elements as you can possibly think of. All of this advice in this probably overlong video should be adding up to the thesis point, which is to make your Mind Flayers scary and unpredictable and formidable by making them your own. Don't worry about the lore of Mind Flayers from the D&D multiverse, because chances are, especially if you have a GM in your party, your players may have already read the Mind Flayer lore and be familiar with it. Which leads me to my final point about what Mind Flayers want. What is their end game? Now, I vaguely know this from the D&D multiverse. They're trying to rebuild an empire they once had. It's something along those lines. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's 4th edition. I don't know. Because when I present Mind Flayers in my campaign, I'm going to choose what they want for myself so that it makes sense to me, but I'm not gonna tell my players, and I'm not necessarily even gonna make it something that they can learn. I'll give you an example. When I used Mind Flayers the first time, a couple of campaigns ago, and I had them in that haunted citadel that I mentioned earlier, they mind blasted the entire party because the party arranged themselves in a line, and it stunned almost everyone, and it would have been an absolute TPK. But I had decided that the reason my Mind Flayers were here was not to conquer or kill. It was to study. The Mind Flayer wanted to see how the humanoids would react to being mind blasted, to psychic energy. And as it witnessed this effect on them, it stood there, it studied them, it got closer, its tentacles reaching out and sliming over some of their stunned faces, and then it teleported away. Why? Well, it had gotten what it wanted, but the players had no idea. And this made the Mind Flayer actually more terrifying, especially because it didn't stop there. The Mind Flayer kept coming back and applying new tests and new things that the party had to overcome, new challenges. The players knew that the Mind Flayer could eat their brains if it wanted to, and so this constant threat loomed over them. And honestly, in the campaign, that was going to be the ultimate end game of the Mind Flayers, was to eat a brain at the end, the final delectable part of their research. But the player characters got out before that happened. So what do your Mind Flayers want? Do they just want to eat brains? Do they just want some of that delectable halfling brain? Do they actually want world domination and they are building an empire? Do they just want to study humanoids of the mortal realm as potential future thralls to take them away from the mortal realm? Maybe they have no interest in ruling over this muddy, disgusting pit of a place that as they see the mortal realm. Maybe the Mind Flayers do want to rule over it because they're searching for a new home. The one thing I just advise is that while you might want to decide what your Mind Flayers are after, this doesn't have to be apparent to your players and doesn't have to be something that they ever learn, because the more mysterious your Mind Flayers are, say it with me now, the more formidable they are. And being formidable is half the battle for a monster. And that is how to run Mind Flayers in your Dark Fantasy D&D campaign. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be back every week with more videos. And of course, every like and subscribe is like a delicious, delectable brain to a Mind Flayer. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out how to make vampires formidable up here. And if you enjoyed this video, you can also check out more tips about Dark Fantasy, such as our transformation videos, which will be down here. And of course, I will be back next week with a new Dark Fantasy D&D video. Hope to see you then.
See you then.